All right, everyone. So we were talking about um, typefaces and properties of type, like including line height and uh, things like that. Let's talk about paragraphs. Okay. So what's the difference between working with character settings versus paragraph settings? Well, glad you asked. Whoops. My computer's flipping out. I don't know. Hold on a sec. Looks like it crashed on me. All right. So the difference here between character settings can literally be for a single character. Like literally like the letter A or like the letter B. So I could take the letter A, if I was inside of here, I could literally have just a single character like the letter A, and we could play around with the typeface and the size of it and leading and all that good stuff. When we talk about paragraph settings, paragraph settings are for a group of words, okay, or a group of sentences, I should probably say. So, for paragraph settings, it's like, there has to be minimum number of words and a minimum number of sentences and all that good stuff. So let's talk about typographical properties that apply to that. So first is alignment, okay? What alignment really means is like there's this, if you're talking about languages that go left to right or right to left, there's kind of this invisible line that your text kind of lines up to, okay? We call that the flush side. So here, this is like this invisible line that sits here on the left. That's the flush side. And then the side where the text is a little bit uneven, we call that the ragged side. So this would be like an actual realistic example of that. So I could take this and add a line here, or I could have. Maybe I have to delete that bad boy like that. Okay. And you can see that my text kind of sits upon or matches up to this left-hand side here, where that cannot be set for the same thing here. Here you can see that there is, you know, space and all that stuff. So we would call this side the ragged side and this side the flush side. Different kind of alignments you can have. You can have left align, which means the text is aligned to the left side and the right side is ragged. You can have it be the opposite, where it's right aligned and all the text lines up to the right side, and the left side is the ragged side. You could have your text be centered, which would mean that the text kind of sits evenly on both sides. There's kind of this imaginary mirror point, as I call it, like that, where it's like both sides are kind of even with each other. Or you can also have justified, where text goes all the way from the left side all the way to the right side, meaning that there's no spaces. Okay. The way you can do this is by usually adding spaces between words or between letters on occasion. A couple other typographical properties we can play around with are indents. Indents are when you take a paragraph and you bring it closer to the horizontal center. So in my document here, it's like if this is the horizontal center, if I can bring the text inward a little bit, that is an indent. Okay. You can indent on the left side. That's typically how we normally see it. You can indent on the right side. And you can also do what's called a first line indent, which, wait for it, indents on the first line, hence the term first line indent. And why would you do a first line indent? At least in English, first line indents are usually used to denote the beginning of a new paragraph. Okay. Finally, we have spaces before and spaces after. So the idea is that, with the block of text as a whole for the paragraph, you can have space above or before and space below. The point of this is to make the text easier to read. Um, so to show you guys kind of an example, just from a literal point, if you were to try to read this and you were try to read this, most people would find the one on the right easier to read. Why is that? So the text I gave you is actually literally the same size. It's literally the same text, right? So why is this a little bit easier to read than this? And the answer is there's something called law of proximity, which is in design. Sometimes when things are close, our brain kind of makes it one big chunk. So what's happening is your brain is going, oh, this is one thing, right? Whereas these spaces kind of denote the beginning and the end of these paragraphs. And so your brain kind of automatically kind of breaks it into smaller chunks. Now, that doesn't really seem like a huge deal, but it actually makes it easier psychologically for your brain to read it because dealing with smaller bits is easier than dealing with one big bit. So, typically we might apply a space before or space after. Here's some just general, good design tips. Um, I would recommend at the beginning when dealing with type not to really have more than two fonts. If you start getting too many fonts, it can start to feel a little bit jumbled and garbled. You can mix and match classifications, meaning if you want to have like, say, a sans serif body text, main text, and a serif title, that can work. Or having like maybe a script type or a decorative type title with the main type being like a serif or something like that. Try to avoid having what are called widows. Widows are when you have text that's like the last word. So in other words, like if this was, let me explain what that would be like. Like usually it's when you have bigger blocks of text, if I'm being honest. But like this is like a widow. It's sort of it's a word by itself. And so, you try to avoid that if possible. It's not always possible, but sometimes people try to play around with spacing and things like that. Another thing is having hyphens that go between lines. A hyphen is, used to connect words. So like bluish green or something like that. Sometimes when you have long words, depending on the situation, the hyphen might, break, or you might get like really long words where it's like MISSIPPI, and then like this gets sent to the next line. And I typically don't recommend that. I typically, try to avoid that if possible. You have a large amount of text, like a paragraph. I typically, like more than a couple of sentences, I typically recommend aligning it to the default of that culture. Now, what I mean by that is in English, as in most Western languages, people read left to right. So if you have a long paragraph, I would align it to the left. If it was a culture, maybe Middle Eastern culture like Farsi or Hebrew, where people read right to left, then maybe, align it to the right side. So it depends on the culture of that particular language, how people typically read it. You typically don't want lines that are too long. You want about somewhere between 45 to 90 characters. So like, if you were to try to read this, this is actually harder for people to read than something like this. Why is that the case? And the answer is actually when you have very long lines like this, your literal eyes have to move to see all of it. And that's actually harder for your brain to read faster. Something like this, which is a little bit shorter, is easier because, you can read it from line to line without having to move your eyes at all. Okay. Um, Couple other things. Try to avoid these big dips, these rivers, so to speak. Your your brain doesn't really like all that white space. It would rather have smaller white space if possible. It's always good when dealing with type to have what's called contrast and emphasis. That's where you make things stand out against each other. So, for instance, like, if you have a title, having the title be physically larger than the main text makes that text stand out, gives it contrast, gives it emphasis. This is where using a different typeface could come into play, where like this typeface might be different than this typeface. There's also something called the law of proximity, which is although you might want to put a little bit of space, you don't want things so far away that they're difficult to read from each other. So even if you have a title, let's pretend that this is the title, I wouldn't want the body text so far away that these feel disjointed from each other. Okay. All right. So those are just some general typographical concepts and tips. How do they play into what we've been talking about? Glad you asked. So let's talk about paragraph options. I'm going to go to exercise 12 here. And so I got a paragraph here. I think that's this one, right? All right. So what I'm going to do is you can highlight the text just by highlighting, clicking and dragging. You can see here underneath my character options that I have paragraph options. So the top one is the alignment. So right now it's aligning to the left. I could align it to the right side, or I could center it, which means the text is, even on both sides. I could also do justify, which means the text is, I probably wouldn't do it for the title, but I might do it here for, say, so see how this goes all the way from one side to the other, and you can tell that it's doing that by adding like a little bit of space in between there. Here, might be a good example of adding in space above and space below. So like, or here, this is space above, space below. I can kind of add a little bit of space there. Let's say I wanted to do indents. This is a left indent. This is a right indent. I'm going to take this last paragraph here, and this could be a first line indent. Okay. Same examples. Maybe I might take all of this, highlight. I could play around with alignment or I don't know, spacing of things. This is not paragraph options, but you can see I can kind of play around with the line height or the spacing between my lines, as it were. Okay. All right, last thing I want to talk about when it comes to fonts is um, how fonts relate to projects. Okay, so in this course, I've talked about how when you have an InDesign file, sorry, an InDesign, an AEP file. Let me draw something here. That you're your After Effects project file is separate from your videos. So for instance, like you bring in like an MPEG-4 video, or you bring in a, I don't know, like a PSD file or a JPEG or whatever. These files are kept separate from the AEP file. That's actually why, when you work on your project, you have to keep all of the files, or you should keep them all together. So you don't accidentally lose them or anything like that. The way it works um, with fonts is fonts are actually installed on the device. So in other words, you guys are looking at me on my desktop or my laptop computer. Okay. So when I use whatever fonts I have are on my computer, but let's just say for the sake of argument, I took this file and I went to a different computer. Let's say I went to my work computer, or let's say I switched to a computer at Chabot's, in their lab or something like that. They would all, if I was working on a project, they would also have to have that same font in order for my project to be able to recreate that font. In other words, in order to produce a typeface, the device you're on must have that font. Okay. So if you're switching computers, it's a good idea to keep a copy of the font so that you can install it in case that other computer doesn't have it. Okay. So here in exercise 14, um, if you take a look at this typeface, see under text, it says Napoli Italiana. That is the font that that I created this AEP file with. It was on a different computer, except you guys don't have it, right? And so that's why it's not becoming visible here. When you see that little brackets around it, that means you're actually missing the font. Because your computer doesn't have that typeface installed, you are not getting the true way that the project's supposed to look. So how do you solve this problem? Well, this is why having a copy of fonts are really helpful. What you guys should do is whatever computer you decide to go to, you should install that font into that computer. So I'm going to go to Font Book here. And why don't we install that font, add font to current user. And then let's go to today's files, which is under exercises, exercise 4, Napoli Italian. I totally butchered that, but hey, let's pretend I didn't. Okay, there we go. There's the typeface. Okay. And now that I've done that, when I go back to After Effects, you can see that this has now been replaced. It replaces it with the correct font. Okay. So what did we learn? If you guys are going to switch computers for whatever reason, let's say you go from your computer to your work computer, or to someone else's computer, your friend's computer, to a school's computer, and you're dealing with fonts that are not common fonts. It's not like Times New Roman or Helvetica. It's something more unique, like something like this typeface. I always recommend you keep a copy of the font. That way, when you switch and you're getting that issue where it's not coming through, you just install the font onto the computer, and then that solves that particular problem. Okay. All right. I hope you learned a little bit more about type here. Try those out. That would be exercise 11 or 12, 13, and 14, please. Okay.